This morning, Prince William opening up in a rare and candid conversation about supporting both his wife Catherine and his father King Charles in their cancer journeys.
The metaphorical rug can be...
When a king realizes he can no longer wear the crown, when the weight of centuries becomes too much for one man's shoulders to bear, on the evening of October 7th, 2025, something extraordinary unfolded behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, something that would shake the very foundation of Britain's monarchy. The gates shut early, the flag dropped to half-mast, and the world watched in stunned silence as whispers began to spread. The king was breaking. No grand announcement had been made, no official statement released, yet everyone could sense it. Something was terribly, deeply wrong. Stay with us, because what happened in those hours would change royal history in ways no one saw coming. The letter that changed everything. The morning unfolded with its usual sense of order inside the palace. Guards stood motionless at their posts, the faint echo of footsteps drifted through polished corridors, and King Charles maintained his customary precision, following the same routine that had shaped his reign. Yet, at exactly 2:47 p.m., that rhythm broke. A courier, dressed in plain attire and carrying an air of urgency, stepped through the royal gates with a single cream-colored envelope, its seal embossed with an unfamiliar insignia. Even the most experienced officials hesitated. The message was marked, "For His Majesty's eyes only." No one dared ask questions. Within minutes, Charles sat alone in his private study, the weight of curiosity pressing against his chest. He opened the envelope carefully, expecting another administrative document, perhaps a report or memorandum. Instead, what he unfolded felt different, its tone too deliberate, its pages too heavy. The first few sheets appeared ordinary, referencing internal estate audits and asset evaluations. But as he neared the final page, the atmosphere seemed to shift. His eyes caught a glimpse of something impossible. There, etched in distinct blue ink, lay a signature that halted his breath. Elizabeth R. It was unmistakable his mother's handwriting.
Queen has left a tantalising secret right here in Sydney. A sealed letter, personally written by the monarch in...
The date beside it read, 2019, a time when she had still ruled with quiet strength. Attached was a brief handwritten note, her words precise, yet veiled in secrecy. She referenced something called the Contingency Collection, a private reserve known only to her. It contained correspondence never archived, heirlooms withheld from record, and documents sealed beyond state access. Charles's pulse hammered as his eyes traced the final line, barely visible beneath the thick black strokes of redaction. Only 3 haunting words emerged through the veil: Crown Matter Confidential. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air dense with an unspoken weight. The ticking of the grandfather clock filled the silence as he sat motionless behind his oak desk, the letter trembling in his hand. In that instant, the familiar walls of his study, lined with family portraits and gilded shelves, felt like the bars of a gilded cage. For several long moments, he didn't move. 75 years of devotion, of service, of obedience to the crown, and yet this one document had shattered his certainty. He had inherited his mother's throne, her public duty, and her enduring sense of control. But this was something else entirely. Proof that even in death, Queen Elizabeth II still held secrets too heavy for her heir to carry. What could have been so grave, so delicate, that she'd hidden it from her own son, the king? He read her note again, each word now carrying an unbearable gravity. The truth, when buried too long, becomes inheritance. It echoed in his mind, sharp and cold. What truth had been buried? What inheritance had she truly left behind? Hours slipped away unnoticed as he sat in silence, the fading afternoon light cutting through the curtains like a thin blade. His thoughts swirled between disbelief and dread, between his mother's wisdom and the unsettling realization that she had chosen secrecy over trust. By the time the clock struck 5:20 p.m., Charles's composure had crumbled into quiet resolve. He pressed the intercom and summoned his head of security. His command was calm but edged with steel. "I want a full report, everything connected to the contingency collection." Now, within the hour, a set of classified dossiers was placed before him. As he flipped through them, the room seemed to darken. The documents confirmed his deepest fears. Certain valuable artifacts, letters, private communications, and items of personal significance had been systematically removed from the royal archives decades ago. They were not lost, merely relocated, their existence erased from official records. The files traced the trail to several discrete locations, private properties, trusted estates. But one address, in particular, made his blood run cold: Ray Mill House, Camilla's private home. The revelation struck like a betrayal wrapped in silence. For months, he had poured his strength into restoring the monarchy's image, balancing tradition with modern expectation, mending the fractures left by scandal and time. And now, his efforts teetered on the edge of ruin, undone not by the public, but by the ghosts of his family's hidden past. He sank back in his chair, the glass in his hand trembling slightly as he poured a drink. His mind replayed his mother's words, her steady gaze, her voice reminding him of duty above all else. Yet tonight, that duty felt suffocating. Never complain, never explain. That was the golden rule of the crown, one he had lived by, one that had protected them for centuries.
Dodging projectiles, racism from staff, and speculation from all sides. These are just some of the challenges the royal family has faced since Charles became king.
But another voice, faint, unfamiliar, almost rebellious, rose within him. What if silence was no longer protection? What if the truth itself was the only way to save the crown? He looked up at the portrait of his mother above the fireplace. Her painted eyes seemed alive, calm, knowing, unyielding. For the first time, Charles wondered if she'd left him this letter not as a burden, but as a challenge. And as the last light of evening faded from the windows of Buckingham Palace, one question echoed in his mind like a command. Would he be the one to finally tell the truth? The decision that shook the palace. At 6:05 in the evening, Charles called an emergency meeting. 5 of his most trusted advisors, 1 chaplain and Princess Anne, gathered in a windowless room deep within the palace. The curtains were drawn. No cameras were allowed. No Camilla, no William, just those who had been with him longest. Charles placed the file on the table in front of them, his voice steady but strained. "This cannot stay hidden," he said. "We must reveal everything that was kept from the crown." The room went silent. Anne, always the most pragmatic of his siblings, was the first to speak. "You'll destroy the institution," she warned. Her voice was calm but firm. "If you pull this thread, the entire tapestry unravels." Charles met her gaze without flinching. "Then it deserves to unravel." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. No one breathed. They all understood what he was saying. This wasn't just about documents or missing heirlooms. This was about whether the monarchy would continue to be built on shadows and silence, or whether it would finally step into the light, even if that light burned. One advisor tried to reason with him. "Your Majesty, the public doesn't need to know everything. Some things are better left in the past." Charles shook his head slowly. "I've spent my entire life believing that, and all it's done is make me a prisoner of other people's lies." That was the moment he made his decision. Not to abdicate, not to resign, but to confess. To stand before the nation and admit that the crown had been hiding truths for far too long. To acknowledge that the weight of secrecy had become unbearable and that he could no longer carry it. By 6:47, the broadcast room was being prepared. Staff moved quickly but quietly, setting up cameras in the blue drawing room, a space reserved only for moments of grave importance. Funerals, deaths, royal confessions. As Charles straightened his tie in the mirror, one thought pulsed through his mind with relentless clarity. The crown was never meant to hide the truth. The broadcast that stopped the world. By the time the sun disappeared behind the palace walls, the entire nation was holding its breath.
In the imperial state crown and Queen Mary's crown waving to the thousands of people who are thronging the Mall, who have braved the rain and are here to witness an historic moment.
News had leaked that the king would address the country, though no one knew why. Speculation ran wild. Was he ill? Had there been a scandal? Was the monarchy in danger? Outside the gates, crowds began to gather, holding candles and phones, waiting for answers. Inside the blue drawing room, the chandeliers cast long shadows across the gold trim and faded portraits. This was where monarchs were supposed to look untouchable, immortal, above the concerns of ordinary people. But that evening, the man standing at its center looked anything but royal. He wore a simple black suit, no crown, no regalia, just a white pocket square, and the weight of a lifetime pressing down on his shoulders. At precisely 7 o'clock in the evening, the cameras began rolling. Charles took a breath, glanced once at the notes in his hand, then set them aside. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and fragile, in a way the public had never heard before. For many years, I have carried this responsibility with devotion and humility. But tonight, I must speak not as your king, but as a man who has reached the limits of what duty can demand. The words were simple, but their impact was immediate. Across the country, people stopped what they were doing. In living rooms, pubs, offices, and hospitals, screens flickered with the same image: a king, unguarded and alone. He continued, his voice growing steadier. The crown, as you know it, has been built upon centuries of silence. It has survived wars, loss, and betrayal by pretending pain does not exist. But pain does exist, and so does truth. There was a pause long enough for the entire nation to lean closer. Then Charles took another breath, deeper this time. I have learned that some truths, buried for too long, do not die quietly. They find ways to rise. Through us, through history, through the very walls of this palace. And tonight, I cannot continue to serve while that silence remains unbroken. The phrase "cannot continue" struck like thunder. In newsrooms, journalists froze. Outside the palace, the crowd gasped. Across the world, from New York to Sydney to Manila, people stared at their screens in disbelief. Charles looked directly into the camera, his eyes wet but unflinching. This is not a moment of shame, but of reckoning. The monarchy must no longer be a shield for secrets. And if stepping aside is what it takes to restore trust, then I do so willingly with love, not resentment. There it was. The word no one thought they would hear. Step aside. The control room erupted in whispered panic. Advisors signaled to cut the feed, but Charles raised his hand, silently commanding them to let him finish. I know this news will bring uncertainty. Some will say I am abandoning my duty. Others will understand that duty, when done too long, begins to consume the man who carries it. I do this not to weaken the crown, but to save it. He paused one final time, his voice breaking just slightly. History will decide what this means. For me, it is simply the end of one life and the beginning of another. Then he stepped back from the microphone. The cameras cut, the lights dimmed, and for the first time in 75 years, the blue drawing room fell completely silent. Outside, the palace gates became a sea of flashing lights. People pressed forward, some crying, some cheering, all trying to understand what they had just witnessed.
We made a great effort, and I'm only the historical consultant in a huge team on the crown, I must make that clear. But we made a huge effort to understand Prince Charles, where he was coming from.
Across the world, the headlines wrote themselves. King Charles steps aside. Monarchy in crisis. But inside that room, alone once more, Charles felt something he hadn't felt in decades: relief. The aftermath and the new beginning. By dawn, London carried an unfamiliar stillness. The rain had lifted, yet the clouds lingered, swollen with unease. Across the world, screens glowed with the same haunting image: a monarch undone, his crown uncertain, his people bewildered. Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowd had swelled through the night. Some raised placards declaring "Truth before throne," while others whispered calls for resignation. The air buzzed with tension, neither furious nor forgiving, but suspended in disbelief. Reporters murmured, cameras rolled, and yet no one seemed to know what to feel. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't triumph. It was something deeper, a quiet reckoning, the sound of a nation realizing that even kings can break, and that sometimes truth carries a heavier crown than power ever could. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. Advisors moved like ghosts through corridors, their faces pale, their voices hushed. The king's private secretary fielded calls from world leaders, Commonwealth nations, and members of parliament, all asking the same question: what happens now? In Canada and Australia, constitutional experts scrambled to explain what this meant for their ties to the crown. In Washington, the White House released a carefully worded statement expressing respect for His Majesty's personal decision. But no one really knew what came next. Not even Charles himself. He spent that morning alone in his private study, staring at the pile of unopened letters on his desk. Messages from citizens had been flooding in since the broadcast, thousands of them. Some were angry, calling him a coward. Others were grateful, thanking him for showing that even kings could be human. One letter, written in a child's handwriting, simply said, "Thank you for showing us that even kings can cry." When Charles read those words aloud to his advisors later that day, his voice broke again. "That," he said quietly, "is the monarchy I wanted to build." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Anne, standing by the window, said what everyone was thinking. "The crown endures, but it will never be the same." At 10:15 that morning, Prince William arrived through a side entrance, avoiding the cameras. When he entered his father's study, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. "Have you come to lecture me or to listen?" Charles asked, his voice tired but calm. William hesitated. "I came to understand." They sat across from each other, father and son, king and heir. For the first time in years, they spoke not as royals, but as men. Charles explained the letter, the secrets, the weight that had finally become too much. William listened, his expression unreadable. When his father finished, William leaned back in his chair and sighed. "The people need stability, father. If you walk away, I'll have to take the crown sooner than anyone expected." "Then take it," Charles said gently. "But take it for them, not for the institution. Lead differently. Lead as yourself." William studied him for a long time. "And what about you?" Charles looked toward the window, where pale sunlight was finally breaking through the clouds. "I'll still be here, just no longer above them. Perhaps for once, I can finally be among them." That evening, in a quiet ceremony attended only by senior ministers and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Charles signed the documents that would transfer his daily powers to William. The younger prince would become Prince Regent, acting on behalf of the crown, while Charles retained his title. It was the quietest revolution in British history. When the signing was complete, Charles removed his signet ring and placed it in his pocket. He walked alone through the palace courtyard, the lamps casting soft pools of light on the cobblestones. For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about duty, legacy, or history. He was thinking about peace. The next morning, he walked through the palace gardens, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. The roses had begun to bloom again, stubbornly, even after the storm. He paused near a marble bench where his mother once sat during her final summer. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, with a small smile, he whispered to the wind, "It's lighter now." And so, the story of King Charles III became not one of failure, but of courage, the courage to face the truth without a crown to shield him. He showed the world that monarchy is not merely about power or inheritance, but a test of humanity and awareness. That day, the crown did not fall, it transformed. The monarchy bowed, yet it did not break. In that humility, it discovered a new strength and a deeper truth. Charles proved that true leadership is not about commanding, but about understanding. The bravery to speak truth, the wisdom to admit flaws, these are what define greatness. Perhaps that was the lesson he left for generations to come, that even those who sit upon thrones are not perfect. A monarchy is strongest when it dares to be human. And Charles reminded the world that real power lies in the courage to surrender before truth. So now I want to ask you, if you were in his place, surrounded by centuries of history, bound by duty, and burdened with impossible expectations, would you have had the courage to walk away? Would you have chosen truth over silence, even if it meant losing everything you'd ever worked for? The weight of a crown is not just gold and jewels, it's the cost of every secret it hides. Tell me what you think in the comments below, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. If this story made you see the monarchy in a new light, if it stirred something in you about leadership, legacy, or honesty, then hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this. And don't forget to subscribe, because next week we uncover another royal secret that could rewrite everything we thought we knew about the crown.